Hello, we're back once again on the COVID-19 podcast. Now, this is a podcast where we talk anything and everything COVID-19, as well as debunk myths related to the pandemic. As always, this podcast is proudly brought to you by the Namibian newspaper, Osisa, and the Namibian Media Trust. My name is John-Colin Namene, and I'm joined by researcher at the Survey Warehouse, Christie Keulder. Welcome to all of you listeners, and welcome, Mr. Keulder. How are you today, sir?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Excellent. I'm happy to be surviving at the very least. Now, you brought us another interesting column. I think it's an interesting element that you brought out, seeing that generally people, when they talk about finances and the pandemic, they just focus on the economy in general. But you brought up an interesting element. But anyways, economies the world over have been sort of severely bruised by the pandemic, and no one really knows how or when the pandemic will end. So global and local economies will obviously continue to be on the receiving end, and in turn, this will impact the prospects for work. Now, in your article, you write about the current economic developments possibly shaping the prospects for finding work. Um, which one of these developments do you think are the most important or the most interesting?
Well, we in this column we've basically summarized some of the trends that we've observed through a series of surveys about COVID-19 and the impact that it's had on businesses. And we wanted to identify some of the trends that may shape the future for jobs and job creation, which also means the availability of jobs for people like first-time entrants into the job market, students that have finished their studies and so forth.
Right.
So this is basically what we've observed and how this would be challenged. And then at the end, we try and identify the few places where we think there may be opportunities for innovative small businesses or even individuals. So we've identified 7 of these trends.
Yeah.
One has to understand that when COVID came around, the Namibian economy has already been in trouble for a number of years. And that has led to a very high unemployment rate, especially amongst young people, I think over 40%. So things haven't gotten better. One of the things, for example, that we highlight is the fact that the pandemic hasn't created a large number of new jobs as it may have had in economies such as the American economy. There were very few new jobs created. And very few companies have managed to grow their businesses during the pandemic. Right. In fact, we see that the pandemic has created a large pool of surplus labor, people who got retrenched or people who got laid off or people whose work time has been reduced. So we have all these skills now suddenly available in the economy. Yeah. And companies that said that they will, when the recovery happens and they're in a position again to employ, they would like to recruit from that pool of surplus-proof labor. Right. It's not as if they're going to recruit somebody without experience. So that means that very few new jobs have become available over time, and a lot of jobs have been lost. We also see that the anticipated online retail revolution hasn't happened. We haven't seen an explosion of online shops or platforms, apps, those kinds of things. Yeah. Which means that people have been moved online. And we see that a lot of people use online platforms as a result of the pandemic, but it's mainly to communicate, with remote workers. It's not a kind of an economic activity, a value add. There are, of course, 1 or 2 websites that's gone on. I see recently the Namibia Craft Center has lost an online site. And I know the ONL group has moved online. But those are small in terms of the anticipated revolution, so to say.
Do you think
I
this
think
is
most people
because,
still shop.
sorry, Christy, do you think this is because the consumers are sort of slow to reacting to the online shift, or is it that businesses themselves just aren't proactive enough or reacting well as well?
Look, what we see is that businesses are struggling with two main challenges at the moment. They're related. They are not at full capacity, so mainly due to a lack of demand.
Yeah.
And that stems from households having to shift priorities, having to do with less, make do with less, because of the fact that the COVID pandemic has impacted their household income levels. But then, with reduced demand comes a reduced turnover and income, and which then means sort of a lack of cash flow. Yeah. So a lot of businesses are using whatever savings they have to survive, rather than to build new business models or launch new innovations. Which I think it's from both sides. People still like to go to the shop rather than buy online. One also needs to understand that our online community is very small.
Sure.
So maybe they don't see it as profitable enough, but that hasn't happened. So we haven't seen this big demand for tech skills that we've seen in other countries.
You mentioned something. Sorry, go ahead. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
No. The one thing, for example, that we see has come about is the demand for multi-skilled work. Businesses that have reduced their staff have to do the same kind of work, but with less people, which means that people who previously were specialists in certain positions now have to become multi-skilled. There are many examples of how this has happened, but let's take, for example, a photographer. These days, photographers have to do videography, they have to do drone work, they have to do all these things. You can't just be one of those.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot. Sorry, I just wanted to touch on that quickly as well.
Kind of hire, say, three.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that quickly as well.
In terms of, yes, yeah, no, sure, and it happens in most facilities.
Yeah, so essentially, multi-skilled staff.
Say, for example, a lodge scales down on the number of room service or room cleanings, or there's this sort of multi-skilled.
Yeah. So essentially, multi-skilled staff members are sort of replacing specialists, like future specialists, right? So that makes me wonder.
Yes, I think that's going to be it.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, will tertiary institutions now become obsolete or sort of pointless, since workers will gain the skills that is basically taught in theory in varsities and in colleges? So that means that the pool that's coming out of varsities and colleges, the graduates that are coming out of varsities and colleges, won't have a space to infiltrate the workforce, since their required skills, or the skills that they have gained, is now sort of the skills that the existing labor force has already had and also has already learned.
No, I don't think tertiary education will become irrelevant or superfluous. I think what will happen is that there will be a combination of skills. Let's again use an example. Somebody studies architecture, ends up working as an architect. Now all of a sudden, there's this pandemic. It closes down large parts of construction. The construction industry, of course, over time now in Namibia has had problems. But let's say the COVID put a further hamper on activities. An architect loses his or her job. What else can they do? And that's the key issue, right? So if you can only do one thing, your chances for finding a new job in this kind of economy is greatly reduced. But if you combine the study of architecture with a few other practical skills, such as business skills, for example, then an architect could start a small business. And it could be a business that delivers services to companies like his that he's been retrenched from. we've seen, for example, in certain parts, the media has, in South Africa, for example, what the media has done is they've gotten rid of staff because the cost of company of permanent employment is very high.
Yeah.
And then they've rehired the same people as consultants or as gig workers, freelancers, to reduce cost to company. So as that kind of skilled person, there's always something you can do, whether it's, say, for an architect doing a very small niche-oriented service to other architects who would be reluctant to appoint somebody to do that job. Now they can just hire that job in as in if they require. Yeah. So I think that's another trend where people will. We've seen throughout our entire economy, Namibian economy is mainly medium, small, and micro enterprises. Mm-hmm. As people retrench staff, of course, companies become smaller. Medium companies become small companies become micro companies. And that affects their ability to recover. The smaller the company, the harder it is to access, formal credit and those kinds of activities. So, I think it's a situation whereby we'll see smaller businesses teaming up, doing jobs together or sharing expertise or sharing costs. Yeah. Those kinds of things have already started to happen. And then, of course, we'll see the informal sector expand greatly as more people would enter the informal sector as their only possible way to find new employment. Yeah.
Now, Christie, so sorry to cut you there. It seems like with me and you, when we have a conversation, it seems like we talk just way too fast because we're sort of running out of time. I think we only have 2 minutes left. Just shortly, can you just quickly tell us where the opportunities for the country lie with the current development that?
Yes, I think in a column we've identified 3 areas. Mm-hmm. One is occupational health and safety. Mm-hmm. As COVID will be around for a long time, and as, say, sectors like tourism and international travel becomes a viability again, there will be a continuous demand on COVID hygiene, sanitizing buildings, sanitizing facilities, training people in the use of PPE, the manufacturing of PPE. Yeah. Training on social distancing, shaping workplaces physically for social distancing, developing screens and those kinds of things. The second one, of course, is food production and food manufacturing. Namibia has been exposed for its extreme vulnerabilities to food insecurity. Most Namibians buy food in a market, could be a formal or informal market, a supermarket, doesn't matter. Yeah. But they need cash to buy food. I think there's a lot of scope for even small-scale backyard farming for vegetables, selling that to your immediate community, your neighbors, to larger projects. I think there's sort of interesting options around new technology, old technology, in terms of, say, things like horticulture, or not necessarily horticulture, but let's say aquaponics, permaculture, beekeeping, worm farming, compost making. These are all facilities or skills that could feed into a larger production of food. And then food preservation. How do you make enlarge the shelf life of food, pickling, fermentation, preservation, all those kinds of things. It could be done on a small scale, but it could also be done on a larger scale. So I think everybody's got an opportunity there, especially if we could start using technology that removes the need for large tracts of land and large volumes of water.
Exactly.
And then digital skills, whether it is to train people on how to use communication platforms better, develop perhaps online courses for businesses that could be used through online platforms. I attended a webinar the other day where a large number of people were connected from all over the world, and there's a particular guy that runs this, and he does it full time for organizations. Make sure all the systems are in place, that the recordings take place, the questions are recorded, and so forth.
Yeah.
Again, it could be something that small businesses could benefit from, but also larger businesses or individuals.
Definitely.
The key would be to find
again, Christie. Okay, just wrap up quickly. I'm so sorry. We seem to be done with time now, but I'll give you a few seconds to wrap up.
Yeah, the key would be finding a niche and developing a product in that niche.
Yeah. Well, again, it's quite unfortunate that we have to cut this short, but I think the opportunities and options you've mentioned are quite interesting. And I think it comes obviously at the expense of, us dealing with a very depressing situation. But that's the silver lining in this case and in this context. So thank you once again, Christie, for making time to speak to us again. Another interesting conversation with you. Thank you, listeners, for joining in. As I said earlier, this podcast was brought to you by the Namibian newspaper, Osisa, and the Namibian Media Trust. My name is John-Colin Namene. This was the COVID-19 podcast. Till next time, cheers.